Hi, my name is Jim Ryser, and I'm the Program Manager for Chronic Pain and Chemical Dependency Services at Methodist Hospital with Indiana University Health. We're going to talk a little bit more of the street definitions of addiction and kinds of the different ways of treatment for the disease itself, and how 12 Steps plays in both addiction and chronic pain. Addiction is kind of an interesting illness because it is its own illness. It's a neurobiological disease of the brain. Its manifestations is continued use despite adverse consequences. That's the most simplistic form that we see, or continued use despite threatening or adverse consequences. With process addictions, we usually say like a continued behavior despite threatening or adverse consequences. But the adverse consequences are the key to addiction.
Who gets addicted?
I was speaking to a colleague the other day who's an RN, and she had a very dear friend whose daughter graduated valedictorian from high school, and she was in college to get her RN, happened to be at a party where they had some pain pills, and she happened to take one, kind of the thing to do, and ended up overdosing. And so you would think, why would this happen to this person? You know, this person who took a prescription drug on a recreational basis and ended up in really big trouble for the first time she used. And of course, we know we have the old thought process of what the alcoholic or what the addict is, the guy under the bridge or the guy tapping out a vein or something along those lines. The real answer is we don't know who gets addicted and who doesn't as far as predictability. But this is a disease of equal opportunity. Anybody can get addicted if they have the right genetic component and the exposure.
Why can't people use willpower to stop using drugs or drinking?
Sometimes I'll talk to somebody who says, I've tried my willpower so much to try to quit, and I can make it 3 or 4 days, and then suddenly I just can't do it anymore. And this is not a disease of willpower. This is a chronic illness. And so you have to have specific treatment protocols in place. It's not a matter of using willpower, it's a matter of using resources to help you with this disease. Because once the craving starts and the compulsion to use starts, there is nothing that's going to stop that person. And it's interesting because over time, a lot of times people will say that they were using just to feel normal. We'll hear this with every drug of abuse. People will not necessarily be using for effect. Now they'll be using to avoid withdrawal. And that in itself becomes its own cycle in order to continue feeding the habit. So why do we call addiction a disease? Well, this is a disease, it's a brain disease, and it's also in a social context. So the symptoms of addiction are a little bit different than things that you might see with other chronic illnesses. So one thing that we look at is, are there financial issues? If a person's selling their power tools to get cocaine, that's pretty diagnostic. Another one is relationship. A lot of times the person may think they're doing well and their spouse is saying, no, he falls asleep after eating dinner of Cheetos in front of the TV, and that's the last time I see him until the following day. We might see physical problems, swollen liver, enzymes and things of this nature from alcoholism. We can see constipation and signs of intoxication from overuse of opioids. A lot of people report legal issues. You know, sometimes somebody says, well, if I get a DUI, does that mean I'm alcoholic? Maybe, maybe not. It could have been a mistake. Your second DUI, something we need to kind of take a look at. And if you get a third DUI, the Attorney General certainly thinks you got a problem. So these are things that we look at. And those are objective measures. We can actually measure these things based on talking to the patient or the patient's family members. And last but not least, which is difficult to assess on an objective basis, are the spiritual consequences. Spiritual consequences, so many people will say, I feel completely alone and isolated. And one of the reasons that we use 12 steps to help treat this disease, it works for many other chronic illnesses. Chronic pain has some of these same kinds of issues. You'll see relationship issues with chronic pain. You'll see financial issues, inability to work. They affect your job. So you see all these different things that are very similar. Isolation is one of the final straws in that. And that's where the spiritual consequences come into place. So a lot of times people will say, I haven't been with my friends. I don't necessarily, I just want to be alone. And people aren't designed to be alone. And so that's why fellowship and 12 steps are such a powerful tool for the disease of addiction and frankly for chronic pain.
Are there different severities of addiction?
Severity of addiction can kind of depend. A lot of times people say, well, I only drink on weekends, or I only drink X amount, or I only use X amount. From a severity standpoint, what we're seeing is how bad are these consequences and how easily can we treat them. A person who's motivated, a person of high SES, a person with education, and a person with money has a tendency to get better quicker and have longer term sobriety. And this is just the nature of this type of disease. So low SES, lack of motivation, some of these other folks may benefit from other forms of treatment than perhaps 12 steps and abstinence-based. Perhaps they would have some counseling and some replacement therapy for opioids, for example, to where they can have a better function, because that's really the job of the programs, is to have better function.
Is addiction hereditary?
There is a hereditary component to addiction based on what we've learned in alcohol studies and some others. A lot of times people say, Chinese goat herder doesn't get alcoholism. Well, why? Because there's no alcohol. The nearest bar is 800 miles away on foot. So those people are generally not going to see some sort of an issue with addiction. However, you take those people out of that society and mix them with regular society where mood-altering drugs and alcohol are available, their prevalence rate goes to 12 to 15%, just like the lifetime prevalence rate across the United States of America.
What kinds of treatments are there?
There are several types of treatment for the disease of addiction. Our program at Methodist Hospital has followed an abstinence-based and 12-step. It's sort of a poor business model, if you will, because one of the things we want people to do is to not need us anymore. So we want them to spend some time with us, get the recovery skills that they need, and move right on with their lives. Because the reality for these folks is that this is a disease, addiction is a disease of 100% recovery, and the treatment is free. If they can get involved in outside support groups and meetings, it's amazing to see how well people do. We have 5 things that we say that we need to do on a daily basis, which is don't drink, use, or isolate, go to meetings, talk to your sponsor, pray, and exercise. And if a person follows these 5 things, they'll be able to stay sober for a day. And as time goes by, they can stack these days together and have much better quality of life, and that's generally what we see. There are opiate replacement therapies. We use some antagonist and agonist, some people in our field. Either one of those can benefit people. However, the studies are not there that show long-term success with these. So again, the studies that show opiate replacement therapy, for example, they show the patient will retain in treatment for a longer period of time. But there are also studies for heroin use that if a person's given heroin, they'll stay in treatment longer too. So a goal of getting off of opioids in the long run should be a goal. However, there are sometimes people that will stay on them for a long period of time. So it really is dependent on each individual. And one of the things that we try to do in recovery is look at each person as an N of 1.
What does a person have to do to ensure sobriety?
Well, one of the things that we talk about with addiction is it is a behavioral-based illness. It certainly has a stigma because it does have a social context. And so, you look at other behavioral-based illnesses. Let's take cystic fibrosis, for example. And a person with cystic fibrosis, there are certain things that person has to do on a daily basis. They have to take specific medications. They have to have some physical things that help loosen up the phlegm in the lungs. And there are certain things they have to do every single day. And these are behavioral things. It's the same thing with addiction treatment. Treating that behavior, continuing to reinforce behavior, continuing to focus people on a lifestyle of recovery, that's really the key to long-term success in recovery.
Why do people relapse?
Well, if we look back at the cystic fibrosis example for a second, this will help explain relapse. I think with addiction treatment, there's a stigma if a person relapses that they've failed treatment. And I don't agree with this, because let's look at the cystic fibrosis patient. I've known several people with other chronic diseases who really get sick and tired of treating their illness, and sometimes they just stop doing it. And it makes sense to the person who's, I'm tired of having to deal with this. I just want one day where I don't have to mess with it. Well, this could potentially hurt and harm that person. Would we call that a relapse? Perhaps, if the person with cystic fibrosis ends up with an infection of some sort. If a person relapses with their drug of choice, it's a little bit different because the social consequences are there. So if a person overdoses and dies, that's pretty dangerous, and that's a pretty big problem. So we do everything we can to avoid relapse, but at the same time not to condemn the person who does relapse, because again, this is a chronic relapsing disease. And sometimes people will say, well, I hate these treatment centers who say relapse is part of the disease. I do believe relapse is part of the disease. I do not believe relapse is part of recovery.
Why would someone recommend abstinence for addiction treatment and others recommend replacement therapy?
There's been a disparity in opiate replacement therapy since the 60s when methadone first came out. I think as Western medicine, we always look for the quickest, easiest way out and oftentimes hope that it's going to come in a pill. And there has been good evidence of harm reduction as a result of the use of opiate replacement therapy. HIV and hepatitis C rates go down, crime goes down, so we do have good research that suggests that. However, with an abstinence-based model, that's more of an individual base, and to me, I'm less in the long run about harm reduction. I'm not poo-pooing it, but where I'm looking at is what's best for that individual. And if that individual's freedom comes from getting untied from the healthcare system, and that helps them have a better, more productive life, I am all over that.
Can an alcoholic use other drugs, or do they have to stay away from everything?
In abstinence-based sobriety, we want people to stay out of all mood-altering drugs. The brain pathway for the feel-good part of it, which is really our medial forebrain bundle, that pathway can be lit up by other mood-altering behaviors and substances. So we try to limit things, and quite frankly, the better off, the more a person avoids all mood-altering substances, the better off they're going to be in all long-term sobriety. Typically, we don't see process addictions and substance addictions co-occurring. So for example, the alcoholic often is not going to go develop a gambling addiction, but sometimes people will develop certain other things. And so again, having a process that provides abstinence keeping that medial forebrain bundle at a more natural level. And for example, a study that was cited 11 years ago, people who were using cocaine when they got sober, who drank alcohol, tended to relapse on cocaine much faster, 92% actually.
Can anyone be cured of addiction?
Chronic behavioral illness. Can it be cured? There's many chronic behavioral illnesses that can't be cured, but all of these illnesses that we talk about with chronic behavioral, type 2 diabetes is another good example. Can we cure that? We can certainly manage it, but the brain will never go back to the day before it was insulted with a drug of choice. So cure is kind of a long shot, but good, solid treatment is pretty easy. And again, addiction's a wonderful illness to treat because the treatment itself is free. It's available all across the world, and people can have better, productive lives. So thanks for watching this little vignette on this end of addiction. You might be wondering why I'm sitting here in a recording studio. I personally am a recovering person. I was on opioids for chronic pain for 18 years, and I've been off for the past 17. And music was a part of my life beforehand, and in my early recovery I kind of got away from it, but it's now a part of my life again. And when people tell me I want my old life back, I say, if you want, you can have better than your old life. You can have the best life you can ever have. Recovery from addiction is not only possible, it's definite if that's something that a person really wants. So thanks for joining me today, and hope you have a great, great day.